Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. We're so glad you joined us today. My special guest is Dr. Sara Gottfried, one of the world's leading women's health physicians, and it's so great to see you again.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So you recently just wrote this wonderful new book called The Brain Body Diet, which talks specifically about the woman's brain. And believe it or not, folks, women's brains and men's brains are different. We're not saying whose is better, but they are definitely different. In fact, if you have just the brain scans, 8 out of 10 times you can see what the gender of the person is just by looking at their brain scan. So how are men and women's brains different?
Well, they're different in a few ways. There's a structural difference, there's a molecular difference, and then there's a functional difference. And these differences add up to some of the changes that we see between men and women in their risk of disease. So women have double the risk of depression. We have double the risk of insomnia. We have double the risk of Alzheimer's disease, higher rates of autoimmunity, higher rates of anxiety. But let's go back to how these differences are manifest. And I like that you said, we're not going to say one is better.
Although we know, wink, wink.
So we know that they're different. And the reason why I care about this difference is because when you understand the difference, it helps the women who suffer more so that we can figure out how to solve it. So one of the big differences is structurally. Women have a bigger hippocampus. So the hippocampus is where you do emotional regulation and also memory consolidation. It's where memories are formed. So there's a big difference between men and women, but that also means since women have a bigger hippocampus, we're more vulnerable to toxins, to eating too much sugar, to too much stress. Men have a bigger amygdala. That's the part of the brain that looks for threat in the environment.
And impulsivity.
Impulsivity, exactly. So there's those differences. Probably the biggest difference is hormones. So sex hormones are different. Women have more estrogen, we have more progesterone, we have less testosterone compared to men. And that's why men do so much better with weight loss than women do.
Frustrating.
And then there's brain chemistry differences. So these are called neurotransmitters. Those relate, again, to the hormones, because hormones can change. You know, for instance, estrogen can change your oxytocin level. That's one of the reasons why women do better with oxytocin. If you hug a man, you have to hug them 3 times as long to get the same bump in oxytocin. So you have to remember that with the guys that you're hugging. And then there's functional difference. So functional differences are crucial too, because women tend to, we tend to multitask better. We tend to, we're more vulnerable to stress. And this is a big issue because I feel like, you know, sometimes we talk about stress and people's eyes glaze over. And I just think it's essential that you have a strategy for how to rise above the stress.
And, you know, you talk about things like Alzheimer's, depression, stress, anger. These are all things that I see in so many women in my life. So many women I love who are miserable, women who struggle with being overweight, and all of these things, and people who are just overwhelmed and generally literally feel that they can't handle their lives. And it's heartbreaking, really, that this is going on. And what I love about your book is that you offer practical tips to correct that. This is not something that's just happening to women on an individual basis. This is common with all women, especially women who are eating a lot of the processed foods and the sugars and the terrible diet, the sad diet, standard American diet. Talk about how diet influences the way we think and even our mood.
Well, this is a crucial piece because, you know, an important part of the brain-body connection is how the gut is talking to the brain. So this is known as the gut-brain axis. The food is the most important driver of your gut health. So if we look at, for instance, the microbiome, this is the set of microbes that you have in your gut and their DNA. The most important influence on your gut is food. Number 2 is stress, but let's stick with the food. So you want to feed the good bugs. You do that by eating prebiotics, by eating certain vegetables, things like artichokes, Jerusalem artichokes, onions, garlic. Those things feed the good bacteria. You want to be eating about 1 pound of vegetables per day. That's essential to get the fiber that you need to stabilize your blood sugar, which helps with all of these things that we talk about. So with blood sugar, if you have a problem with blood sugar, and you may not even know, you may have prediabetes or slightly rising blood sugar, that leads to cognitive decline, where you walk into a room and you can't remember why. It leads to brain fog, leads to that sense of overwhelm and anxiety.
Wow, this is fascinating stuff. We're going to talk a little bit more about the diet that heals your brain and also helps you lose weight. So stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're here talking with Dr. Sara Gottfried, author of the new book, Brain Body Diet. And you talk so much at length in here about the ways, the things that we should be eating to heal our brain, which heals our emotions and heals our cognitive function, the way we solve problems, and also prevents Alzheimer's. And we touched briefly before the commercial break about the evils of processed foods and sugars. And I don't really think that we drove that home enough. On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad are these foods?
Well, I would say if 10's the worst, processed foods are a 10 because they poke holes in your gut. And when you poke holes in your gut, when you increase your intestinal permeability, it leads to inflammation in the body. 70% of your immune system is in your gut wall. And then it leads to a problem with the blood-brain barrier. So you start to poke holes in the blood-brain barrier. Now, the blood-brain barrier gets thinner as you get older, so you're more vulnerable to problems. It then leads to inflammation in the brain. That's the precursor to all these problems we're talking about, the anxiety, the brain fog, the depression, the Alzheimer's disease.
Mm-hmm. Wow, so we really need to stay away from processed foods. A lot of people say, what are processed foods? We're talking about the fast foods, the drive-thrus, but also the foods that come in the boxes. How would you describe processed foods?
Well, processed foods are the opposite of whole foods. The foods that you buy in the produce section, so the broccoli, the bell peppers, the greens, the cage-free eggs, the chicken that's organic, the grass-fed beef, all of those things are whole foods. Those are much better for you. The salmon, let me not forget the salmon, so good for the brain. Those are whole foods. That's what you want to emphasize. The food that comes in a box, that didn't grow in the ground, that didn't run on the planet, those are processed foods.
And also the drive-through, the fast food.
The junk food.
Those are so bad. And they're everywhere, too. They're really hard to resist, but so bad. And I noticed that in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, which is a very respected publication last month, showed that processed food increase our risk of all causes of death by 14%. That's shocking.
It's shocking, and it makes total sense to me because it increases inflammation in your body. I think of inflammation almost like a fraternity party, where it starts off, a little inflammation is actually okay. That's a normal part of the process of repair when you have an injury. But when it goes on too long, it's just not good. So this is sort of the fraternity party you don't want happening in your body.
No Animal House in the head. I love it. That's going to really stick with me. And then, of course, too much sugar, which kind of goes hand in hand with the processed food. Sugar can be so bad for us, even our homemade baked goods and things like that. It's really hard to get those things out of the diet. But a lot of people ask, what can I eat? What can't I eat? And you really go into great detail in the book, and I love it. But let's get back to what you were talking about with the gut microbiome, having the good bacteria in there. You said that the processed food actually harms your gut and your gut lining, and then the sugar. But also, don't antibiotics really do a number on our gut as well?
I'm so glad you brought up antibiotics. I had this experience myself where I went through a surgery in 2017. I took a month of antibiotics. I tried to talk my surgeon out of it, but no go. And so here's what happened. A few weeks after the surgery, after this month of antibiotics, I had anxiety for the first time in my life. And it was because of the inflammation. It was because I had changed the good and bad bacteria balance in my gut. And because I'm kind of a nerd, as you know, Lori, I tested a good nerd. I tested my microbiome before the antibiotics and afterwards. I had an 87% reduction in my diversity of my microbiome. Now, what does that mean? That means I took kind of this healthy balance of good and bad bacteria, and I narrowed it down to just a lot of bad bugs and not many good bugs. And so I've had to spend the past couple of years kind of rebuilding my gut, but it really brought this point home.
So try not to get sick in the first place, and so that you don't need an antibiotic. Sometimes if you have surgery or whatever, you can't help it, but then put those good bacteria back in. And again, you have listed in the back of this book some excellent probiotics, because a lot of people are overwhelmed with the choices of probiotics, and you have some good ones listed there, so that if you do have to take an antibiotic, you know what type of probiotic to take. And even if you don't take an antibiotic, we should all be taking a probiotic every day as well. So we're going to take a quick break and be back with Dr. Sara Gottfried. When we come back, we're going to be talking about intermittent fasting, what it is and why it's so great for your brain. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Healthy Living. My special guest is Dr. Sara Gottfried, author of the new book, Brain Body Diet, How to Heal Your Brain so that you look great and feel great and think clearly, because so many of us struggle with brain fog and the muddled thinking. And also, this diet helps prevent Alzheimer's in women and men as well. But women, we know, have twice the risk of Alzheimer's as men. Now, before the break, you talked about intermittent fasting. We hear so much about that these days. What exactly is that?
Well, it's eating the way our ancestors ate. So we know that our ancestors did not eat until a few hours after the sun came up, and then they would stop eating a few hours before the sun went down. So what that typically means is that you're eating within an 8-hour window with an overnight fast of 16 hours. There's a number of different protocols. That's the one that's been proven to be the most effective at helping with your blood sugar. And when you help your blood sugar, that prevents about 60% of cognitive decline.
So what exactly, so you're recommending that people do this every single day, and so they only eat between the hours of like 8 a.m. and 4 p.m.?
Well, I work with my patients to figure out the best timing for intermittent fasting. And what I encourage people to do is to have a slow on-ramp. You know, not everyone can do what I do, which is to eat between 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. every day. It makes you kind of a social outcast because it's very hard to go out to dinner. But
no fraternity parties.
No fraternity parties. But what I encourage people to do is to start with 2 days a week. If you do 2 days a week, maybe separated by 3 days, what that does is it starts to clean the gunk out of your cells. It starts to reset the adipostat, which is what burns fat in the brain. And it also helps you with that blood sugar control. So start with 2 days a week. What I do with a lot of my patients who say, I can't do 16-8, is we start with 12-12. Can you stop eating at 7 and then eat at 7 a.m. the next day? A lot of my patients, because they're social, need to have their window between 10 and 6 once they get to 16-8. Other people eat between 12 and 8. So you do this. I think you tend to have a window that adjusts.
Right. I do. I cut off my eating at 6 p.m. So, yeah.
And that's a good compromise for most people.
Right. When you talk about controlling your blood sugar, a lot of people don't really know what that means, but this controlling your blood sugar helps you with your cravings, right? If your blood sugar is under control, you're not going to crave the sweets and the processed foods. You'll be able to drive past McDonald's without pulling into the drive-thru if you're managing your blood sugar. Talk again about the benefits of managing your blood sugar. What are people going to feel when their blood sugar is under control?
Blood sugar is so important. If you learn nothing else today, I hope blood sugar is a big takeaway. Because a lot of people don't realize that they have a problem with blood sugar. They just notice that the scale keeps going up. So their weight keeps rising. They notice that they have brain fog. They notice that they can't find their keys. They walk into a room, they can't remember why. They have a word on the tip of the tongue and they can't think of the word. So all of those things can be related to blood sugar. what happens if you get your blood sugar back into control? And I'm not talking about the US average, I'm talking here about optimal blood sugar ranges. Hemoglobin A1C less than 5%. Fasting blood sugar between 70 and 85. 2-hour postprandial less than 115 milligrams per deciliter. When you do that, you're able to burn fat. You're not having the sugar cravings. You're able to drive by, you know, the place where you get the milkshakes. So it's just so much better for you in terms of your health.
And what I also thought was interesting that you brought out in your book was obesity and the correlation between obesity and the way we think, the size of our brain, and our risk for Alzheimer's.
This is huge. I mean, what happens, especially for people who are stressed, but we know this also begins to happen for women when they go through perimenopause. So this begins in the 40s. Changes start to occur in the brain that predate the diagnosis of Alzheimer's by 25 to 30 years. So what happens? There's a metabolism slowdown in the brain. It's called cerebral hypometabolism. That's a scientific word. It just means things are kind of slowing down. And I think a lot of women, many of my patients over 40, notice this. So they're not quite as sharp. Their processing speed is not quite the same as what it used to be. And we know this is related to the gut-brain axis. So we need to do what we can with the food, with the way that we rise above stress, with things like meditation and other tools, exercise, getting together with our girlfriends to manage this process so it doesn't lead us down that path toward Alzheimer's disease.
Well, you just led into our last segment beautifully, because it's more, having a healthy brain is more than just about the food that we eat. We're going to talk about stress, the silent killer, when we come back, so stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living. My special guest is Dr. Sara Gottfried, author of the brand new book, Brain Body Diet. It's fantastic. All these wonderful tips on how to heal our brain, which is really the very foundation of who we are. And one of the ways we really need to heal our brain is to deal with stress. A lot of people think there's nothing they can do about the stress in their lives. They've got to battle the traffic. They've got these kids and a full-time job, and the list goes on and on, president of the PTA. But there are ways to manage stress. Can you talk about that a little?
Well, this is so crucial because we know the state of our mind is related to how we navigate stress. And I think the research, especially of Elizabeth Blackburn, who got the Nobel Prize in 2009, shows this. We know that people who have a high level of perceived stress and a more sedentary lifestyle, so they're not exercising, are the ones that fare the worst in terms of aging. So they tend to have shorter telomeres, which means that they're aging faster, and that especially means the brain. So brain body is aging too fast. There was a study looking at women compared to men where they looked at scans of the brain, and they found that in women starting in their 40s, the brain starts to shrink. The more stress that you have, the higher that your cortisol is. It also affects your memory, so it affects function. And this is women in their 40s. Average age was 48 in the study. So I'm not talking about people in their 60s. We're talking about people in their 40s.
Yes. So how do we reduce stress? A lot of people say, well, I can't quit my job. You know, I have to endure this commute every day.
Well, the good news is it's not how much stress you have. It's your perception of the stress, which is under your control. So there's a lot of ways to navigate this. And I encourage people to come up with a list of their top 3 ways or their top 5 ways to navigate stress. So the idea is that you're rising above it. The best way that I've found for me is with exercise. So exercise really helps me to become more stress resilient. We also know that meditation, it doesn't matter what form. It could be prayer. It could be yoga. It could be loving kindness meditation. It could be mindfulness. There's lots of different ways to change the cortisol pattern inside your body. We also know getting together with girlfriends is so good for your cortisol because it lowers cortisol, it raises oxytocin, it reduces inflammation. It doesn't work as well to get together with men.
Why am I not surprised? So yeah, ladies' night.
That's right. And then there's
girlfriend.
supplements. There's supplements too that can help you navigate your cortisol levels. Things like phosphatidylserine. We know rhodiola is very effective. We know that fish oil, which also, by the way, reduces your risk of Alzheimer's disease. So 4 grams a day has been shown to reduce cortisol and to lower your risk of Alzheimer's disease by up to 70%.
This is such great news because a lot of people think they have to change their life and the things that are immovable in their lives to reduce stress, but really you're saying you can still have the same life, and it's the perceived stress. So increase your exercise, supplements that you mentioned, which are in here, getting together with friends, and talk about sleep.
Oh, sleep is so important. So one night of bad sleep raises your cortisol very high, makes you have more sugar cravings, makes you make bad choices throughout the day. One night of good sleep, and here I'm talking 7 to 8.5 hours, about 90 minutes of deep sleep, making sure you're getting the REM sleep, you don't rack up a sleep debt. Those things help to get cortisol back where it needs to be. And it does this cool thing. It creates a shampoo in the brain that gets rid of the brain trash. It gets the toxins out of the brain. But you have to have that full 7 to 8.5 hours to get the lymphatic system to shampoo your brain.
But so many people have difficulty sleeping. How do they get a good night's sleep?
Well, you have to architect a good night's sleep just the way that you architect a good life. And so I encourage people to start a wind down process. I mean, you can't watch, the latest spy thriller and then go to bed and expect to fall asleep immediately. That's not going to happen. You have to kind of create the right environment for good sleep. So I take a hot bath with magnesium flakes. I use essential oils before I go to sleep. We know lavender is very effective at helping you relax. I am in bed by 10 o'clock. Like that's when the angel train leaves the station. So I have to be in bed by 10.
Oh, this is great information. And if you want, again, the great sleep tips, they're in here as well. Dr. Sara Gottfried, you are such a blessing. This is another home run as far as I'm concerned. You wrote the book about the hormone reset diet, which helps so many people. And then your wonderful book, Younger. And folks, if you want to see information about those books, go to cbnnews.com. And this is a fantastic book, The Brain Body Diet. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson, and we'll see you again next time.